Hey everyone, who needs a graphics card, right? All you need is a Ryzen 7600 CPU, no graphics card, and you can game on it all day long, right? Well, clearly not. Last year I did exactly that in my HomeLab NAS system, and the gaming results weren't very good, unless you wanted to game at 720p, which you almost certainly didn't want to do. But since then I've given the system a bit of a glow up, to use the cool kids phrase. I basically upgraded the case to have more cooling. I also changed the stock cooler to a really nice ID cooling one. With the RAM as well, I went from 8 gigs of really slow RAM to 2 sticks of CL30 6000 MHz RAM, and that makes a big difference, especially with AM5. And finally, I moved everything from a SATA SSD to an NVMe SSD. Will that lead to better gaming results? Well, yes, it almost certainly will, as we'll look at in just 1 minute. But because I have extra thermal headroom as well, I thought in this video it would be cool to play around with overclocking and see whether I could get slightly more FPS rates. And finally, I invested £5 of my hard-earned money in lossless scaling. So I also, towards the end of this video, play around with that and see whether gaming performance can be improved even more on a Ryzen 7600 system with no GPU. Before I dive into the new results, which I'll do in just 1 minute, I wanted to very briefly recap on the old results. And Skyrim looked quite good at 4K, but we were averaging 8 FPS rates. It was more of a slideshow, not exactly very playable, and we've seen this throughout all of the games. OG Crysis, if then we dial it down to 1080p, it averaged around 23 FPS, which is almost playable, I guess, but you still wouldn't really want to rely on that. It does struggle. And whilst it's pretty impressive that Crysis can run on an integrated graphics CPU and no GPU, it's still not really great. And if we look at all the results here, 4K and 1440p was never playable, 1080p was barely playable, and it was only really at 720p that things were half decent. And that's why I wanted to do this test, to actually upgrade the hardware, because you don't really want to game on 720p. Enter the OnlyFans build with some upgraded hardware like the RAM and the storage, but obviously extra cooling as well, and immediately we've seen an uplift. So in The Witcher 2, previously it was unplayable at 1080p, but now actually we get in an average around 29 FPS. Previously that was just 12 FPS, so that is quite a significant improvement. Yes, it's still not perfect, and sometimes we had screen tearing and things like that, but overall it was a lot better, especially considering there's no graphics card here. I know this is an older game, but I think this is actually a fairly good result, get in 2 to 3 times the performance. But it's not all sunshine and rainbows. I did sort of cherry pick one of the better set of results there, and it was quite a good improvement, to be fair. But next we look at Rocket League, which didn't fare quite as well. At 1440p, we were averaging around 22 FPS, which at least is slightly better than the 19 FPS rates we were seeing before, but it still wasn't very good. And it is just a little bit jittery overall, so you wouldn't really want to play on this. 1080p though is a bit better, as you can see here, but actually no real improvement compared to the old hardware, or maybe losing 1 FPS. But overall, we didn't see that much change, apart from a 4K where Rocket League didn't run at all on the old system. It was just too laggy and wouldn't boot up. If you want a game at 13 FPS goodness, you could do that, but you probably wouldn't want to. But overall, no real change here. But we did see more difference on something like Skyrim. For example, on that, you can see here, everything is a lot better. 1440p, we go to an almost playable 27 FPS. At 1080p, it's 41 FPS average, which is actually really good. And remember, there's no graphics card here. This is just on a CPU that's not actually designed for gaming. So I think this is actually a fairly impressive result. And as we've seen earlier, we see quite a nice improvement in Witcher 2 as well. So 720p is a dramatic improvement, doubling. 1080p is more than doubling performance, and we see that again with 1440p and 4K. And yeah, you're not going to want to game at 20 FPS average at 1440p, but now 29 FPS at 1080p is something you might want to game on. And I think that's credit to moving to 2 sticks of RAM. I think that's the main thing. But next up, can it run Crysis? Well, yes it can actually. Amazingly, we see a lot better improvement at all resolution levels. Yeah, you wouldn't want to play at 1440p, again, because it's only 18 FPS average, but at 1080p now you've got playable 32 FPS, which I know is lower than the 60 FPS average some people like, but I think if you're going to game without a graphics card, maybe aiming for 30 FPS might be a better idea. However, unfortunately, Final Fantasy HD Remastered, it just seemed to struggle, last year when I did these tests, and it continued to struggle. Yes, we did get a doubling of FPS rates in 4K, but obviously 6 FPS still isn't playable, that's a slideshow. But what you will notice is the temperatures. So previously it was 54 degrees Celsius if you look at the GPU bit, but because this is integrated graphics, that's effectively the CPU. And if we keep looking at the GPU bit, we now go down to 38 degrees Celsius. which means of course that we've got more thermal headroom on the system. It no longer runs as hot, which can only mean one thing: overclocking. But be fair warned, I'm not very good at overclocking, and my CPU is probably drafting its resignation letter as we speak. So here we go, nothing to be concerned about. I went into the BIOS, which is OZ Tweaker, haven't done this in a long time, and I read on Reddit that you can get around a 5.4 GHz overclock with increasing the V voltage, so I tried that a little bit, and I booted up into Windows. And actually, it seemed stable, or at least you can see Task Manager, it running at 5.4 GHz, so I thought I'd run Prime 95 and actually test this out. I'll skip ahead a bit now, but although the temperatures were quite high, they weren't substantially high and things seemed to be okay. Wait, I achieved a 5.4 GHz overclock on my very first attempt. I'm a hacksaw cracksaw, I'm an overclocking god. We need to jump into a game and actually see the gaming performance. Yeah, so as you can tell from my sarcasm, previously we were seeing an FPS average of 15 at 4K, now it was down back to a slideshow of around 6 to 8 FPS, so it was dramatically lower. So I think even though I had run Prime 95 for a whopping 2 or 3 minutes, something clearly was wrong. I probably needed to run it for longer, and we would have seen that something was actually not very stable with the overclock. So I'd given it a bit more V voltage, increased the frequency for some stupid reason. As I said, I'm not great at overclocking, and then I seen something that said graphical clock, so I increased that too. What could go wrong, right? Well, we're about to see, aren't we? So this is back in the system, and Prime 95 was running, but then we start getting errors. You can see there, one of the cores has failed, and then one of the other cores has failed, so Prime 95 is detecting a hardware fault, and in the Task Manager you can see there 2 out of the 6 cores have completely failed, and that's what we were probably seeing before. You know, my overclock wasn't stable, and that was affecting FPS rates. So to be honest, at this point I just thought, let's go back to auto, in other words turn off the auto clock and see what else we can do, because obviously the AMD software actually allows you to overclock as well. So I booted back into the system, and in the AMD software, I turned on the overclock there, which gives you a 0.2 GHz increase, which actually on the CPU isn't too bad, to be honest. So the system rebooted, you can see the CPU voltage there has gone up to around 1.4 volts, but actually it achieved a stable overclock. Hurrah! And because this is through the AMD software, hopefully it's going to be a bit more stable than my own manual attempts, which weren't exactly very good. Prime 95 was stable for 10 minutes, so I launched into gaming, and I seen better gaming results. So whilst previously at 4K we seen 15 FPS, this now was creeping up to around 16 or 17 FPS average. So not exactly dramatic, but it did actually get better results overall when I was playing, which is promising. So then at 1440p I tried that out as well, and previously we were seeing an average of 27 FPS. This then went up to around 29, 30 FPS, so again, clearly a bit better, and I think this means that the overclocking approach that I took with the AMD software is probably a little bit better than me manually trying to do it and completely cock it all up. Because yeah, this is actually fairly good. At 1440p, we're now getting a stable 30 FPS average, which I think is actually fairly impressive for this CPU. And actually, I think that's pretty good. I mean, I went with the 7600 CPU, not the 7600X. So the fact that I did eke out a little bit of extra gigahertz and that resulted in slightly more FPS rates is actually something I'm fairly happy with. But next we can look at lossless scaling and see whether we can push things further to get even better gaming results. So I firstly wanted to try out upscaling without the frame gen, so I put Crysis in windowed 1440p mode, and then I went on over to lossless scaling. So we've got LS1 there, I turn off the frame generation and I click on scale, go back to Crysis. Okay, and at the top left you can see there the actual FPS rate is lower. So obviously instead of getting like a 20 FPS average, it's a little bit lower because there is obviously an overhead with moving to upscaling, but overall this looks really good, apart from the low FPS rates. So I then wanted to try out frame generation, and I know you need a base of 60 FPS really to actually get good results, but I thought let's just try it out along with the upscaler. So it's upscaling there up to 4K, and immediately we were in jelly mode, which as we know now is due to the frame generation and not the upscaler because we weren't getting that before. And clearly this isn't great, we're down to like 9 or 10 frames because of the overhead from both the frame gen and the upscaler, and even though it's upscaled it to 20 odd FPS average, due to the frame generation, it's just not very good. We can tell that, so that's not a good option. One thing I did want to try out though before moving to another game is actually upscaling from 1080p all the way to 4K via the scale factor of 2. And actually I'll turn off frame generation here, but I wanted to see how this would actually perform, because usually this much of an upscale wouldn't look very good, but actually this is pretty damn good. I actually really am happy with this. You know, the fact this is 1080p upscaled to 4K, you wouldn't immediately know that. I mean, it all looks pretty good and sharp. You haven't got a complete blurry mess. I think really the grass sometimes on the edge, you can see some artifacting and it looks a bit too blurry. So that's probably, yeah, you can see there a little bit. But I think that's, you know, one of the things you will see with upscaling, you know, 2x factor here. But overall, this was actually not too bad. I'd actually happily play like this, to be honest. So I decided to move on to another game, and I got Skyrim there at 1080p, and I decided to upscale that to 4K, so again the 2x mode. And again, it looks pretty good. Considering there's no GPU here, I think this is pretty good. Annoyingly though, the mouse did sometimes glitch up, and you can see there I've got the mouse and the cursor. I think Lossless Scaling just bugged up a little bit. And as a result, shooting was sometimes a little bit annoying, but overall, I actually like how this looks. I'm getting 30 FPS average here, and it all looks and feels pretty good. So next, I thought I'll try out with frame generation 2x, and I wasn't expecting much, but this is upscaled to 4K. Then with the 2x frame generation, and you can see it's gone down to like a 20 FPS average base, and then obviously gone back up to 40 frames due to the frame generation, and it's not great. You kind of got that jelly effect. We've also still got the mouse cursor there, so don't worry, that's not yours, that's mine. But actually, it wasn't too bad. There was less sort of jelliness than we had with Crysis, in my opinion, although it was a bit harder to actually shoot. You know, I wouldn't actually play like this because I think the input latency or the mouse bug, one of the two, did mean that it just wasn't really a stable way of doing things. But thankfully Lydia's there finishing the task because I can't shoot for anything right now. But there we are. Go Lydia, go, you can do it. And actually this is pretty cool. I mean, not necessarily some of the bugs I was seeing with frame generation, but actually being able to upscale like 1080p to 4K without a graphics card and getting fairly decent results is actually fairly impressive to me. Now if we look at the overall results, they are a lot better than what we had previously with the old system. So 4K is still not playable, but 1440p starts to become playable in something like Skyrim. 1080p is then playable on pretty much every game other than Final Fantasy HD. And again, because we don't have a graphics card, I'm looking at 30 FPS as being my goal here, and not 60 FPS. But if you did want 60 FPS rates, then 720p would be achievable in a few of the games I looked at. So actually, fairly impressive. So I think we've pushed things as far as we can. Lossless scaling is a good tool. For the upscaling, I mean, that looked really good. Previously, it was a blurry mess when I tried upscaling from like 720p or 1080p onto this 4K monitor, but actually it did help quite a lot. But frame generation, not so much. However, that is to be expected because the tool does say you need really stable 60 FPS rates before you enable frame gen, because things like that and also the upscaler does have a performance hit. So the moment you turn it on, you're going to get lower FPS rates, and that's why they recommend having that 60 FPS base. And as a result, it's not really worth diving into frame generation and things like that at 1080p or 1440p, for example, because you just don't have enough FPS rates as a basis to actually then use frame generation and things like that. But actually, I'm overall pleasantly surprised at just how much extra gaming performance I actually had just from changing the two RAM sticks and also upgrading the cooling and moving to an NVMe SSD. And my hunch is it's probably the RAM that actually increased things the most. But I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please click the thumbs up button and please subscribe to see more videos like this. Thanks for watching.